Thank you for joining this webinar. It will be about X-ray imaging dosimetry challenges. So the program will start with Paula Toroi, which will chair this whole webinar, and we will have several speakers that Paula will detail, and I will let her the floor.
Thanks. So now let's take the introduction here. So I would like to welcome you to the CCRI webinar. It's really my honor to give this webinar on X-ray imaging dosimetry challenges. My name is Paula Toroi, and I have organized this webinar in collaboration with the IAEA. We all know X-ray imaging. It's something what most of us would be exposed to X-ray imaging radiation during our lifetime. When we talk about X-ray system, we have the X-ray tube, the anode, tube wall, which can be changed. We can change the filtration. This defines the spectra. Then we can adjust the tube current and exposure time. And with this adjustment, we can impact the dose. So the dose in this level is the measurable quantity. When we add on the distance and the field size, we can also talk about the patient exposure. And then when we take into account the patient properties, we can talk and we can estimate the patient dose, which is different than the measurable quantities, what we are talking when we talk about dosimetry and dosimetry measurements. Then with this setup, we will get the X-ray image with some specific image quality. And when we want to do optimization between the image quality and the patient dose, we normally aim something like a 7% uncertainty with K equals 2. So this is something which is set in the IAEA TRS-457, that this is a good target uncertainty for our dose measurements or air kerma measurements. Also, because we have detrimental effects for radiation, we need some legislation and requirements to do dosimetry measurements. So when we replace the patient with our dosimeter, we can do the dose measurements. And now, as we just heard from Sören's presentation, many hospitals are not using ionization chambers anymore in X-ray imaging dosimetry, but they're using these semiconductor-based detectors, which also provide not only air kerma, but also other exposure parameters. And that's why we call them X-ray multimeters, XMMs. And you will hear probably this term many times today. So one challenge what we have in this field is that we do calibrations in specific calibration setups and then with reference radiation qualities. And when we do the measurements in clinical practice, they are really changing the spectra quite a lot because we want to have good image quality. So the optimization is done in a way that we change the tube voltage and the filtration to get the best possible image quality for the patient. And we cannot really cover all these situations in the calibration practice. So then to keep the traceability, we need to have an unbroken chain of measurements with uncertainty estimations. And we have to be able to understand how this change in condition will impact on our result and how it will impact on our uncertainty. So for this purpose, we have also this thing that the medical technology is developing very quickly. So we have to be able to take care of these changes. There are new radiation qualities used, especially in mammography, as we just heard, and we have also different measurement geometry. So we need competent staff to do the measurements, and we also need some guidance for these measurements. So this brings me to these topics of today. We need requirements and guidance for dosimetry. We need reliable equipment, and we need competent people. In addition, we need traceability for our measurements, and we need to understand the new technologies and do some research. And in this way, we can achieve accurate and consistent measurements. So these are the speakers of today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this speech. I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction to the rest of the seminar here, and I will talk about the technology of X-ray multimeters. First, a little bit about me myself. I am Sören Sturesson from RTI Group in Sweden. I've been working with in this community for almost 30 years now. We have a calibration laboratory here where I'm technically responsible, but I've also been dealing a lot with technical and applications support throughout all these years. Non-invasive multimeters, XMMs, have been in the market for about 40 years, depending on what we mean with an X-ray multimeter, but we many times say that it's at least something that measures kVp or kV non-invasively together with other parameters. If we start 40 years ago, or 40 years plus, that was when the first non-invasive kV meters came into the market. At that time, it was a device that measured kV, maybe time. You had to have another device to measure dose, and that was typically an ion chamber. Before that, to measure both dose and tube potential, you had to carry around an invasive voltage divider, which took a lot of space and was very cumbersome to deal with. Then throughout the 80s and 90s, the devices became smaller. Still, I would say ion chambers was the dominant type of detector for dose measurements, but solid state technology came in via the ability to measure tube voltage, and those were more started to be combined into one meter instead of different meters. In the 90s, this was furthermore becoming smaller, and the solid state technology came in to measure also the dose parameters. So with that done, it didn't take long until these were combined together into one detector. So we could say that was up till year 2000 roughly. There came different meters with different solutions, but those measured kV and dose simultaneously. Around year 2000, this was further improved, and the detectors were more sophisticated, and one could begin to measure also the HVL and total filtration with the same detector. It could be a built-in detector to one measuring unit, but it could also be a separate detector, smaller detector placed on a cable or connected to the display device. And throughout the years after year 2000, not many parameters have been added, but it has become even smaller, added functionality like wireless technology, getting rid of cables, and also taking data further from the meter to reports, cloud solutions, etc. But pretty much we still talk about the same parameters throughout all these years. We can also look at it in a slightly different way. Same image here that follow the same timeline from the 80s up to today. But if we started at in the 80s, you had more or less a book of correction data. The kV meter was calibrated, could measure at a standard filtration, which most radiographic units was equipped with. It was like 2.5 or 3 millimeters of aluminum in the beam, and that was standard. And then it measured quite okay. But as soon as the spectra changed just a little from that, you had to have correction tables. And that was the case for different radiation qualities, for kV corrections, for dose corrections. Throughout the time, we come to the multi-sensors around year 2000, 1990s. The meter started to self-compensate the values. You still had to select quite a lot of different radiation qualities, which you still have to do, but those has become less and less, and the meters covers a broader and broader use. Coming back to XMMs, X-ray multimeters, what we mean with that is a meter that measures not only dose or not only kV, but measures the parameters, both parameters, and to get possibly together also with half value layer and total filtration. Looking a little bit on the physics behind this, we're coming back to 1980 when I said we measured one measured kV. To measure kV is about analyzing and getting information from a spectra, but it is not the entire spectra. kV, tube voltage, is the highest potential that creates the spectra. So one could say we're looking for the absolutely most right point of the X-ray spectra, where the spectra reaches the y-axis 0. The example here shows a spectra of 50 kV of actually a tungsten aluminum spectra from a MAMO unit, and showing how this spectra becomes affected by adding aluminum and copper, and that is pretty much what a kV meter does. Internally, it has numbers of filters, and behind the filters there is a solid state detector or a detector that detects that catch up the radiation after the filters. That will gender a ratio, and that ratio can be written as a function of the tube voltage can be described then as a function of that ratio. And this will be valid if not varying anything else but the kV. Then this works perfectly. All right, and the better slope there is on this equation or this ratio, the better resolution or more better precision you will have in the kV value. This is a technique that was known long time ago. One started to do this with step wedge filters on film, and you could measure optical density to get a kV value actually. But this also led to only having 2 detectors. You had one ratio, and you could read the kV if nothing else is varied. But if other things are varies, one had to use these, what I said, the book of corrections. If the filtration is not the filtration it was when it was calibrated, one need to apply corrections. And that was how it worked. But with time, this was developed, and the technology became smarter. And in one sense, this is pure physics. If you have by using two signals, more or less one unknown can be calculated. If instead adding one more signal so that you get 2 ratios, from 2 ratios we can from 3 signals we can find 2 unknowns. So adding this 3rd signal and another ratio that can be used to compensate for spectral variations. That is the basics for kV measurements, or for all measurements. If you're adding more signals, more unknown or more compensation can be applied. But there are also other things to think of, and that is important in the design. And one thing is, when measuring these ratios, you have to have a construction that is insensitive to unwanted radiation reaching the detectors, scatter. Just as an example here, if having something that is not protected at all, and scatter is added to the signal, if you put one filter on top of one diode with a thin filter, the contribution from scatter will be decent, but if adding more filters on top of a detector and still having the same amount of unwanted scatter, that will contribute a lot, and that will affect the internal ratio. So it's important to get rid of scatter when measuring ratios like this, which it would be with a fill method or whatever method one uses. And this is a characteristic that is needed for XMMs. From the other side, when measuring dose, you may want to have scatter. Depending on what dose parameter you want to measure, the backscatter should be there or shouldn't be there. If you want to measure incident air kerma, for example, then you don't want to include the backscatter. And that is pretty much what any XMM will measure because of its construction. But if you want to measure entrance surface air kerma, that includes backscatter, then one has to compensate for that or find other methods. And in a clinical situation, the backscatter can be enormous. Looking into the IAEA Code of Practice, presenting data from there, you find factors that is 1.7. So 70% higher dose due to backscatter if you have a high energy and large field size. So this is important to be aware of, and it's also extremely important in terms of the design of X-ray multimeters. Yeah, a little bit more about this backscatter protection. This is more or less how it's solved. Then one protect the detector from backscatter. Actually, you protect it also from side scatters to avoid scattered radiation into the detector. Apart from backscatter, we can also look at design factors and call it front scatter. For example, in mammography, where you use the compression paddle. The compression paddle will contribute to scatter, and different detectors will sense that in different ways. The upper example here shows a very well collimated design, which is the case for many X-ray multimeters. Not all, it differs in design, but as you have to protect for scatter, that is done in to different extent. But it also gives an opening angle towards the radiation that is relatively narrow. And by that, it will hinder front scatter. It will hinder scatter from, for example, compression paddle to reach the detector volume. That is also the case for ion chambers, depending on the ion chamber design, depending on how deep the sensitive volume is placed in an ion chamber. A planned parallel chamber with a detector volume directly up to the surface will be the most sensitive to front scatter, whilst others that has different kinds of position placement of the sensitive volume will also lose some information in terms of front scatter. Also important to be aware of. Other things that adds complexity in today's XMMs is how the market has changed throughout the years. In 1980, we're looking for what type of radiation qualities that were available, maybe missing a few here, but pretty much on radiographic fluorosystems, it was a small range of filtrations in terms of aluminum layers, could have a minor part of copper in the beam as well. In mammography, it was pretty much moly targets and rhodium targets. It was moly, rhodium, and to some extent aluminum filtrations. Today, we have an enormous variety of different radiation qualities to handle. You have wider range of aluminum filtration and copper filtration in radiographic and fluoroscopy systems. On CT systems, you have spectra that varies a lot, and to quite some extent, it's also proprietary information from the manufacturers, what type of material they have in their X-ray tubes and in their bow tie filters. In mammography, yeah, tungsten target has become more or less standard, but with a big variety of different filtration materials. And all those things, of course, has effect to the spectra. That is why they are there. The manufacturers needs to have different spectra because of to optimize image quality with their different detectors has different sensitivity, different tubes has different abilities for output, etc., etc. So with this said, there is a lot of different radiation qualities to handle, and when it comes to calibration of ion chambers and of X-ray multimeters, there is a limited range of radiation qualities available that covers a part of the wide spectra of use. This example is showing the IEC standards RQR 2 to 10, RQT 8 to 10, and RQ8 2 to 10, and those are placed in the range where a clinical usability of different filtrations are present in the market. There are applications where you add as much as 2.5 millimeters of copper. So it's a wide range of use, and this needs to be handled by the XMMs. This is where calibrations are available, but of course the XMM needs to handle much more than that. And when it then comes to the design, one can make it easy or hard for yourself. This kind of exemplifies a hard way of doing it. The green lines represent some kind of internal energy dependence in a detector, and if that's not predictable, it will be very hard to find internal algorithms for the XMMs. But with a good design, it can be much more easy. If there is some kind of harmony in the internal corrections, this can be easier achieved. In mammography, it may be even harder because of the major variation in spectra. For example, two spectra from tungsten aluminum, not too hard, too difficult. They are relatively nice in their shape, but when you come to tungsten rhodium, for example, or tungsten silver, you have major effects of the K-edge spectra, and that also needs to be dealt with by the internal algorithms in the XMMs. Jumping over to half value layer. That is also measured by the XMM today. When it comes to half value layer, the definition is quite straightforward. Half value layer is the amount of filter of aluminum in most cases that reduces the air kerma to 50%. But there are some factors that affects the HVL, and that might not really be part of and clear defined, and that is field size. Is the half value layer affected by field size, and how can that be measured? and so that really adds uncertainty to the HVL definition as such. Other things when measuring HVL in a traditional way is filter purity. Many standards talks about 99.9, 99.5, or some standards even says just 99% pure filters to measure HVL. But what does that mean in terms of uncertainty? Other thing is the thickness of the filter. Filters can easily be 10% thicker or thinner than the nominal value. And it's not super easy to measure that. On a 1 millimeter filter, yeah, that's not too difficult to measure the thickness. It's hard to know and judge about purity. But when it comes to mammography, and you should measure a 0.1 millimeter filter, can you do that with 5 micrometer accuracy? Or can you do it with 10 micrometer accuracy? 10 micrometer accuracy means 10%. 5 micrometer means 5%. Other things is the energy linearity in the air karma detector that is used. That also has contributes to uncertainty, measured repeatability. So with the XMMs, those things are taken care of because these are all built into the detector. The complexity of validating and looking at what is the correct HVL value to compare against, yeah, that is still a challenge, absolutely. But in the daily use of measure, a lot of uncertainties is taken away by handling this with XMM, since that is built in to the detector itself. This is another way of expressing what I've already said before about using ratios to measure different things. Basically, if having more than one ratio, you can plot the ratio on the x-axis and on the y-axis, and then you can plot all this against the HVL. And if you have a nice and smooth function, the HVL can be calculated and measured in one exposure and without adding any filter in the beam, without thinking about much at all, actually. A few challenges about tube potential. It's one thing how the algorithm works internally in the XMM, but it's another thing when it comes to definitions, what to measure, what to look at, what to analyze. And there we have two parameters. You have KVP, peak tube voltage, and which is not really well defined. Again, it's something that sounds very easy to say. Yeah, it's the highest peak available during an exposure. Yeah, but if we look at the image to the left, not uncommonly, you have some kind of startup sequence in an exposure, and if that is a slight overshoot, is that really the KVP value that we want, that you want to show and want to have measured and presented? Is that what the generator setting shall be adjusted to? The community, I would say, says no, it's not. So what KVP value do you want to have presented? Well, I want the KVP value as some kind of average of the peaks. Not a very clear definition, but that is what the community like, and that is what the manufacturer adjusts the generator to, if there is a ripple. Today, that is a much less problem, of course, since every new generator has constant potential. But even a constant potential can have this pre-peak, not uncommon, very common actually. So also there, the question rises, what is the value? What is the KVP value? So KVP, and then the PPV, practical peak voltage, is a defined term by IEC, but it's not commonly used by the manufacturers and generator manufacturers. It's a very neat unit because it has an impact, it has a value for image quality, but it's not commonly used. All these are more about presentation of data with the XMMs. It's about how to find and how to trigger different findings. We're talking about HVL, KVP, and this about irradiation time. Here also comes to definitions. A generator manufacturer look at the exposure time or the time as a loading time. That is the steering signal in the generator. But what matters to dose, what matters to image quality, what matters in practice is the irradiation time. And the irradiation time is defined in at least a few IEC standards. If you look at the dental standards, IEC 601-2, 63 and 65, there is a quite clear definition that says that irradiation time should be measured at 50% of the max value of dose, or stable max value of dose. Many meters measures the time at the trigger point, and the trigger point will vary depending on the sensitivity of the meter. Normally it's not a big difference, but there might be differences, whilst the 50% level is much more clear point. Yeah, that was a bigger image of that. Total filtration, I will just say that very much similarity to how HVL and KV is measured. It's based on the ratios internally. It can be calculated from HVL and KV, then how different type of meters deals with that. I think that varies. The nice thing with total filtration is that it's constant. It doesn't change with energy. Just a few things important to think of in summary of this speech is that there is a lot of things that affect the result, and different meters handles that differently, but it's important to be aware of parameters that has influence on the measurement is things that has effect on the X-ray spectra, such as the tube potential itself, filtration, anode angle, backscatter, scatter from phantoms or compression paddles or other things nearby the detector. And with that said, international standards and definitions together with primary and secondary laboratories who offers relevant calibrations sets a baseline and is important. Usability, use in the daily work in the clinics helps a lot, but also the user has to know what you are looking for. Thank you very much.
We already heard Sören, and now it's time to hear the perspective from the standardization point of view. And I'm happy to introduce Wesley Culberson, who is the IEC leader of the group of the working group 3, where we have all the standards for the dosimeters. So the floor is yours. Welcome. I'm very happy to have your talk today.
Thank you very much. This is great to see all the people joining today. So there must be a lot of interest in X-ray imaging dosimetry. This is great. Thanks for the introduction. I will be talking about some IEC standards that are relevant to X-ray imaging dosimetry. And it'll just be a short 10 minutes and unfortunately no physics. So just talking about what the IEC is about and some of the acronyms and some of the numbers, it gets a little confusing. So that's what I'm going to try to clarify today. And just a short introduction, I'm an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And my connection to this webinar today is that I'm the convener, which is the IEC terminology for the chair of a working group where we deal with radiation dosimeters. I'm also the director of a secondary lab, the University of Wisconsin accredited dosimetry calibration lab. So let's get started here. I don't have any conflicts of interest pertinent, but I will show some products that I'm not endorsing in this presentation. So just a little bit about the IEC. Like I said, it's a little bit of a complex organization. The International Electrotechnical Commission, it's an 118-year-old organization. It's been around a whole long time that designs, coordinates, publishes international standards for electronics, telecommunications. Members are standards organizations from 170 participating countries. Sometimes we just think of countries as being the members, but it's actually the standards organizations from those countries. For example, in the United States, the organization is ANSI. Now, standards in the context of IEC are documents. They're not radiation standards like we think of sometimes in radiation metrology, where a free air chamber is a standard, a primary standard. These are documents, and the IEC publishes around 10,000 of these documents from all sorts of electrical aspects of our lives. The IEC is very similar to ISO, which is International Organization for Standards. And the main difference is just in the scope that ISO has a bit more broad scope, but there is some overlap, and every now and then there's a little bit of arm wrestling involved between these two organizations to make sure there's not too much overlap or conflicting standards that are published. So what's the importance of these IEC standards? Well, they provide a framework for regulatory bodies to build safe companies, to regulate safe companies, and to make sure we have reliable products. They serve as a basis for risk and quality management as well. So there's a lot of testing involved. There's certifications that manufacturers can provide to their users. And it really is to make sure that a manufacturer's promises are kept. So what does it mean for clinical medical physicists? There's probably a lot of clinical physicists on the call today. For both imaging and radiation therapy, to me, it means that you can trust the equipment that you're purchasing. Really, if you buy an ion chamber or you buy an XMM, you don't have time when it shows up to run it through all of its tests. Put it in a pressure chamber and test all of its pressures and different humidities and things like that. So this is really important that we have the manufacturers that are held to certain tests that they need to do. I think it also reduces confusion when when manufacturers aren't using the same terminology, so that when you're looking around at devices, you can compare evenly. For standards labs, people that are on the call, it gives you standard X-ray beam qualities to set up. It sets guidelines for these test conditions, and this is specific for X-ray imaging today. An example of when this might apply is if you've ever seen, I was actually looking around getting ready for this webinar on all the websites of manufacturers I could find that sell reference class ionization chambers. They basically have on their main page reference class in accordance with IEC 60731. So that's how the IEC documents are very important. So you're just sort of trusting that they're following these. Now in the IEC, there's a bunch of committees and working groups. I'm going to just introduce the two pertinent ones. One of them is 62B, which deals with medical imaging equipment, software, and systems. So here are the requirements for error kerma, reproducibility, linearity, tube voltage. This is basically the device itself, the X-ray tube. And more pertinent for today's webinar is Subcommittee 62C. And in there, we deal more with radiation dosimetry. There are 4 working groups within this subcommittee. And the one that's most pertinent is Working Group 3, and that's performance of dosimeters. So in Working Group 3, there's 35 individual members from 14 different countries. And the membership, it's great. It really represents manufacturers, primary standards dosimetry labs, secondary labs, clinical physicists. We have representatives from regulatory bodies like the FDA. We've got researchers even. And our working group, we actively maintain 6 standards, so 6 documents. We meet in person once per year. We just met last month in Washington, D.C. Here's a photograph of 6 of us that were able to make it there in person. We also had a bunch of in-person virtual meeting attendees as well, not shown here. And we have various project groups. So there's usually one of the members of this working group is going to be a project leader for each one of these standards as they're updated. And the convener is myself. Okay, so here's a big table of 4 of our 6 standards. These are the most pertinent ones for the webinar today. The first one is 60580, which is medical electrical equipment for dose area product meters. Those are DAT meters. That standard is actually stable until 2025. In the IEC, we call these stability dates. They're basically the expiration dates for these standards, and they have to be, you have to show that you're working on updates, or else they will basically expire and they'll have to remove them from the website. 61267 is very relevant. This is the medical diagnostic X-ray equipment, radiation conditions for the use in the determination of characteristics. This is these are like beam qualities that are standardized. I'm going to go into detail on a couple of these. 61674 are dosimeters with ion chambers and or semiconducting detectors as used in X-ray diagnostic imaging. So these are XMMs that Sören was talking about. And then the last one is 61676, and this is dosimetric instruments used for non-invasive measurements of X-ray tube voltage. So this is sort of a very narrow specific standard for measuring PPV. And you can see after the name of each one of these standards, there's additions like 2.0, 3.0. There's sometimes a year, and that year is when it was published most recently. And so you can kind of see sort of the life of a standard. There's a whole bunch of versions that come before those as well. So I'm going to just talk about 3 of these real quick, and the most pertinent and relevant standards for this webinar. 61267 is currently in version 2.0, but the 3rd edition is underway, and the project leader, Stefan Pochinger from PTB in Germany, is on the call here. And this deals with standard beams such as RQR, RQA, RQC, RQT. These are all defined here. However, since the publication of the 2nd edition in 2005, there's been sort of an explosion of X-ray conditions and radiation qualities. It's something Sören introduced in his talk. And so due to the large number of these, it's really impractical to list all of their nominal first half value layers. So this 3rd edition introduces a systematic procedure for the characterization and description of X-ray radiation conditions for these additional X-ray conditions. So basically, setting up a way to standardize these conditions without necessarily having it all listed in a table, and then giving a way to validate that half value layer. So it's really simplifying things, and hopefully this will make it through the process. It has to be finalized by August 2025, so we're working very quickly. 61674, and this one is dealing with dosimeters with ion chambers and or semiconductors. This is XMMs. It specifies performance of these detectors and the related constructional requirements. It includes the update has mammography and CT. The third edition is underway. Stefan is also the project leader, and it's in the very final stages. So this new edition is going to have new beam qualities. It's going to remove analog displays, non-rechargeable batteries, and it's going to remove some redundant tests. 61676 deals with non-invasive measurements. So this is measuring PPV. The stability date for this standard is 2026. So we have a little bit of time to work on this. This is a fairly short and narrow standard. What our group is, the working group 3 is really considering is whether or not practical peak voltage is a little bit too narrow of a definition. And I would expect in our update, we're going to be able to provide a new definition or additional definitions, and the data from the Tremexi project will help guide the update of this and how to do these measurements properly. So looking forward, the data from the Tremexi project is going to really inform directly our working group. Is going to feed right in. It's going to, we hope to update the range of relevant radiation qualities and consider recommendations from the Tremexi group on reference radiation qualities for 61267. We'd really like to distinguish better the difference between reference class and field class detectors for diagnostic imaging, and consider a more open concept beam quality spectrum catalog. So right now it's still a little narrow based on some PTB calculations. So we hope to open that up. We hope to establish better performance characteristics of these XMMs, better, more accurate uncertainty budgets for 61676. So my final slide here, IEC standards are really important. It's really important for lots of people dealing with imaging dosimetry. Our working group is very active. We're updating standards constantly as data becomes available. The timeline for these standards is relatively slow. It takes about 5 years, so we all need to be patient. And just a plug in, if anyone's interested in being involved, the first step is to contact your national committee. So the national committees are responsible for nominating experts to participate in our working groups and IEC work. However, guests are always welcome at WG3 meetings and at our project level. So you can just contact me directly if you'd like to be involved that way. If face-to-face meetings are a hurdle, then I would recommend you work at your national level. And the last thing is public commenting periods are really important. This is your chance to give feedback, and we actually have one of these standards going out for public comment right now, and this is very important for our development of standards. So that's all I have. Thank you very much, Paula, for inviting me.
Thank you for this excellent talk. I think it's very, very important for this topic. And I agree with you, the IEC standards are very important. And I'm happy that Wesley is actually our chief stakeholder of the TRAMEXI project. I will talk a bit more about the TRAMEXI project in the end. But now I would like to thank you again, Wesley. And now I will give the floor to Zakithi Msimang, who is representing the IAEA. And she will tell us about the International Code of Practice, the IAEA TRS-457, which is the International Code of Practice for X-ray imaging dosimetry. The floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting us to give a talk on this webinar. And as Paula has indicated, my name is Zakithi Msimang, and I'm working at the IAEA and responsible for the Secondary Standard Dosimetry Laboratory Network. And just to give a brief background, the IAEA had published the TRS-457 in 2007, which detailed the information on radiation conditions that the laboratories could use to perform calibrations of the different equipments that they receive from the users that are used in diagnostic radiology. So it had application-specific dosimetric quantities and also specific dosimetric methods that had to be used. And it covered both from the SSTL calibration lab to the user requirement. So the question was, do we need to update TRS 398? And we thought so, and how did we know that we had to update it? So if we look at this paper that was presented by Ludwig Buhmann in 2010 at IDOS, this paper actually triggered a lot of questions in terms of the use of multimeters, as it pointed out some remarkable gaps or accuracy issues. And then after that, there were quite a lot of other papers, I won't go into details, that were actually looking at the multimeters that we've heard about and looking at their performance in different beam qualities that have been prescribed in the guidance document. And from the IAEA side, I'll just take a step back. So the IAEA uses what we call coordinated research projects to bring together research institutes from developing and developed member states to collaborate on research projects that are of common interest. So immediately after the TRS-457 was published, the IAEA initiated a CRP, which was looking at the implementation of this code of practice. So some of the information that we got from this CRP, the publication, the results of the CRP were published on the IAEA Human Health Reports number 4, and there were about 30 recommendations relating to the implementation of 457, and about 6 of those were for future review, areas that we needed to review, and some future actions. There were about 7. And the nuclear technology review document that was published in 2019 also highlighted the challenges with using the semiconductor-based dosimeters. And in 2017, there was a survey that was conducted by the IAEA for various member states participation. And from that data also, it pointed to the need for us to review the TRS-457. And then there was a recommendation from the SSDL Scientific Committee. So after the recommendation from the SSC, we had our first consultancy meeting in 2020 to kickstart the process of reviewing of TRS-457. How the publication works with us is that before we actually write a TRS document, we will have research projects that will actually help in generating the data that is needed for publishing or updating the guidance document. So we needed then we had the consultancy meeting to advise us on the CRP update, and this was in December 2020. And the experts supported the idea to revise the guidance document, and then the CRP also, and to also provide the inputs on the start a CRP to provide input into the revision of the guidance document. So what the CRP is looking at is bridging the gap between dosimetry in diagnostic radiology from the perspective of the laboratories and from the medical physicists, and providing guidance on the clinical data in different imaging modalities, including those that are not included in the current version of the TRS-457, providing data on the use on semiconductor-based dosimeters from the perspective of uncertainty of measurements that are needed in the clinical field. So the CRP was launched in 2021 and it will run until 2025. The main objective of the CRP is to really standardize the radiology for medical physicists, and also just the instrumentation needed, the equipment and procedures that the medical physicists and the people from the laboratories need to use, and support then the data that's going to come out is going to be used from to update TRS-457. So we have SSDLs that are from the SSDL network and some primary standard laboratories participating in the CRP. And we also have some medical physicists that are coming from hospitals and their associated universities. So the main objective, as I've said, the specific objective is to provide the recommendations on the performance of specific instrumentation that are being used. So currently, as TRS-457 stands, it doesn't explicitly define what a reference dosimeter is. So we'll endeavor to actually define this time to make it clear what is a reference instrument, and then to assess the accuracy of measurements performed using these multimeters, and looking at the different measurements that they can, looking at different things that they can measure, and also whether when you're measuring with it in different beam qualities, whether you're getting the value that you're expecting to get, or is it measuring within the specific specifications that the supplier has stated. And then we're hoping to also develop and test harmonized methodologies for KEMA area products and the measurements relevant for calibration laboratories, and also for the users having the understanding that it's not all the KEMA area product meters that you can remove and send to a laboratory for calibration. Some you have to calibrate in the hospitals, and then to obtain data pertaining to intra and inter-scan variations in measured versus displayed dose indices. So these are the institutes that are participating, and I'm the project officer together with Olivera, my colleague, who will speak also in today's webinar. And the instruments that, so if we're looking at the different instruments, as I mentioned, we will looking at defining what a reference standard is. And we had a survey that looking at the data that we have on the SSDL database and looking at different instrument ionization chambers that are used by member states to actually transfer their traceability in diagnostic radiology. And we're working on defining the conditions of test, looking at what has been recommended previously for RQR beams, but then with, as the previous speaker indicated, that there's such a wide spectrum now of beam qualities in the clinical field. We're testing the dosimeters in different beam qualities, some that are currently used for radiation protection. And we were hoping to get access to a monoenergetic radiation beam, but it hasn't yet happened. But there's also some non-standard radiation beam qualities, which we will have access to through one of the participants. And we will test both the ionization chambers and the multimeters and their responses in those different beam qualities. And on top of that, the multimeters will also be tested in for measurements for ACAMA or for tube voltage and ACAMA rate. So for all the parameters that they indicate that they measure. Because sometimes you find that some of the multimeters, when you input, say, for example, you choose a parameter and say you're measuring a specific filtration, and you put in a different filtration, some can still give you a value. So we have to just test whether if they're giving you a value, is it a value that makes sense or is it a value that doesn't make sense? Because we understand that not everyone that is using these multimeters are trained medical physicists. In some aspects, it's people that are really not trained and might not be able to interpret the data properly. And other considerations that we're looking at is the evaluation of the method for HVLs, looking at what is described currently in the TRS-457 and whether it's really a method that's easy to apply for every member state. And looking at the guidance of how to transfer traceability from the reference instrument to various modalities, investigating the reference dosimetry for interventional procedures and CT, and the role and relevance of a monitor chamber at calibration laboratories, and the use of voltage dividers. I think this has started to be a question from some of the laboratories, whether they really need to have a voltage divider in their system to be able to perform calibrations. And also looking at the cost of acquiring one and maintaining that same standard. And then guidance on commissioning of dosimetry equipment. One thing that maybe I just missed to mention was on the beam qualities, I indicated that we were looking at performing measurements in monoenergetic beams, which hasn't yet materialized. But what we have introduced is to do spectrometry measurements. And we think with that direction, we will be able to clarify more questions, because the detectors that we now have access to can be taken into the hospital beams and measurements of spectrometry be done even on the clinical machines. So we will also work on determining measurement uncertainties for the different measurements that are done in the hospitals and also by the laboratories, and looking at the budgets and all the contributors of measurement of uncertainties in the measurement setups. We know that the setups in the hospitals are quite tricky because it's not like in the laboratory environment where you have all the gadgets to position your instruments. There's a lot of variations in the hospitals, and all that needs to be taken into consideration when you're determining your measurement uncertainties. And really the question is, what uncertainty do the medical physicists need to actually be able to quantify their measurements in the hospital? So the other part that we're looking at is the cap meter and CT, and that's just the scope of the measurements that we're going to look at. For the CT, we're not really going to do any measurements, but we're looking at the data that is already available and having access to that data through the different organizations. For the cap meters, there are some few participants that are going to be setting up for the calibrations of the cap meters and also performing the measurements. So in summary, the concept of reference class dosimeter in that we're looking at the concept of reference class dosimeter in diagnostic radiology, the definition, selection, and establishment of appropriate radiation beam qualities, and the transfer of traceability from the reference instrument to the imaging modalities, and what is the best approach to the XMMs for radiation metrology's perspective. Are we really calibrating these multimeters, or is really just verification and conformity testing? And then looking at reference measurement and reference measurements in certain imaging modalities, for example, the CT, and the need for accuracy and uncertainty assessment. And just a question for the SSDLs that already have the capabilities of calibrating in the area of diagnostic radiology is how many ionization chambers do you calibrate per year for the users? And how many of those of XMMs are you calibrating also per year? And to what extent are you comfortable with the software and the interface? Does the setting match the lab conditions? Is it easy to calibrate this equipment? And thank you. That's the team, the CRP participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakithi. An excellent presentation, and I hope that our TRAMEXI project will also be able to help and provide some input for your CRP project. So
yes,
we are
actually TRAMEXI and the participants, we're hopeful that there's be more publication that are going to come out from TRAMEXI project, and even from the CRP, there already is some publications from the participants. And those papers that will be published will then, the data from those papers will be used to update TRS 398.
Yes, indeed. So we are closely collaborating with these two projects. Okay, thank you a lot. Thanks a lot. So now it's time to go to the world of regulations, and I'm happy to introduce Jenia Vassileva, who was also working at the IAEA before. But now she's, I don't know, free expert working on probably still on many things. And I'm very honored to introduce Jenia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. I will try to get insight into the regulation on X-ray imaging dosimetry, although for most of my life, I've been an end user as a medical physicist, but through the IAEA experience in the last 10 years, I gained also this experience on the role of regulation and mostly on the challenges in the implementation of this regulation. And in my short talk, I will try to make an overview of the current international safety standards on radiation protection that give the framework, and also what are the problems that we have identified and challenges in different regions and countries. And of course, if there is a need to change something in the international safety standards and guidelines available through the IAEA and through the other international organizations, you all know that the radiation protection framework starts from studying the effects of radiation, then recommendation provided by ICRP, and developing safety standards, the process that is led by the IAEA, but in which all member states and also different organizations, international and professional, have the role. So because the IAEA safety standards, starting from fundamentals, requirements and guides, and also supporting implementation documents, go through a formal process of member states comments And that's why they reflect the international good practice and consensus and become a basis for the national legislation and regulations. And in the medical field, there are two standards that are most important and most relevant. International BSS, published in 2014 in the GSR Part 3, and also a specific safety guide published in 2018 that focuses on the implementation of, provides recommendations for the implementation of GSR Part 3. So there are 9 requirements, but I will focus on only one of those that is relevant to the topic of the today webinar, optimization of protection and safety. And according to this, GSR Part 3 gives responsibility, states that that the licensees are responsible for ensuring protection and safety, is that it's optimized for each medical exposure, and further defines 6 main components. In fact, all of them relevant to the today discussion, and I'll go through them quickly, of course, without reading the text, although the full text from the BSS is visible on the slides. The first component is a design consideration for equipment. So we need to have proper equipment that is conform with the applicable standards of IEC and ISO or relevant national standards. And then using appropriate technique, how this equipment is used in clinical practice, developing appropriate protocols that are optimized to give the necessary diagnostic quality at the minimum necessary dose. I'm not focusing on this because it's not directly related to the discussion today, but you can find detailed modality-specific guidance in the SSG 46 on these 2 components. I'll focus on the calibration. BSS defines responsibility for calibration of radiation sources and of dosimeters. On this slide, I'm discussing the radiation sources calibration. That is the responsibility of clinical medical physicists. And SSG clarifies that source calibration in X-ray imaging should be interpreted as the measurement of certain dosimetric quantities defined by ICRU that are modality-dependent, application-dependent, and should be carried out in reference conditions. Neither PSS or SSG prescribes the calibration intervals because it will depend on many different factors, and this is one of the responsibility of the medical physicists when defining the quality assurance, quality control procedure and program. The calibration of dosimetry instrumentation is also one of the requirements of GSR Part 3 that should be traceable to a standard dosimetry laboratory, and SSG 46 defines 3 different ways of traceability to a standard dosimetry laboratory through, of course, national primary or secondary standard dosimetry laboratory in the state or in another state or region, or also manufacturer's calibration if the first 2 are not feasible or not available, provided that they are traceable to a secondary dosimetry laboratory. The frequency that is recommended, it's not prescriptive, but it's recommended to be at interval of more than 2 years. And also, of course, calibration using diagnostic radiology spectra and dose rates representative of clinical practice. Of course, much more technical details are given in other publications like the TRS that Zakithi presented. Another opportunity for calibration for some of the dosimeters, especially for those that are integrated into the equipment, is the cross-calibration of dosimeters. So cross-calibration can be utilized as a part of periodic quality control test. And examples are, for example, field cap meters or CT dose displays. And also when a radiology facility has many dosimeters, then calibration of all of them could be too costly. Cross calibration could be also accepted as one of the options. So I'm grouping these two components of optimization together because they are strongly linked, dosimetry of patients at a hospital level and diagnostic reference levels, because dosimetry of patients has the purpose to establish typical dose values on local DRLs and to compare to national or regional DRLs when they are available. And this is a cycle process. It's a cyclic process with the periodicity frequency recommended 3 to 5 years. And much more detailed guidance is provided in this SSG 46. I'm not going to focus on this. What I want to highlight is that of course, we know that DRLs and patient dosimetry is mostly performed in measurable quantities. They are well defined in different IAEA publications, including TRS-457. And this recent publication on patient radiation exposure monitoring aimed to promote automatic exposure monitoring systems in, of course, modality-specific metric, measurable quantities for DRLs optimization QC, but also there are a range of other calculated dose quantities used for different purposes, mostly for risk estimation and prevention, for example, of skin injuries or estimation of risk to embryo and fetus for assessment of individual risk if this is needed, not for every patient, but if needed. And we have to pay attention on the many aspects of standardization and uncertainties associated with this. So this safety report published last year discussed in details the process of monitoring, recording, collecting, analyzing data manually or automatically, and of course the relevant standards, DICOM, IG, and also highlights the importance of data accuracy verification by medical physicists who play a crucial role in this process. Accuracy of measurements and calculation, and accuracy of data recording and collection, and accuracy of data analysis with attention to the uncertainties. The final, but it's maybe the most important and overarching component of optimization is quality assurance that include, in fact, everything discussed previously. And of course, with a focus on QC, that is the responsibility of the medical physicist, measurements of physical parameters at the time of acceptance, commissioning periodically, after major maintenance, after installation of new software, and the whole process, including the corrective actions, verification of factors used in procedures if something goes wrong, and also periodic checks of decalibration and conditions of operation of dosimetry and monitoring equipment. More guidance is provided also in SSG 46. I want to just highlight that one of the recommendations that periodic checks of decalibration and conditions of operation of dosimetry equipment and monitoring equipment is to ensure that such instrumentation has a current calibration typically conducted within the last 2 years, as recommended in the calibration part, and that is functioning correctly. And the QA program should establish a frequency of calibration. This is the role of the medical physicist. And this applies to standalone dosimetry equipment and to dosimeters integrated into the equipment in the medical radiological equipment, and also phantoms should fulfill the requirements specified in the international guidelines. In the last few minutes, I want to try to summarize some of the implementation problems that we have identified through the different activities at the IAEA, but I could say it's a summary of my own experience, national and international. And I tried to group them into main groups, related to patient dosimetry and related to QC, measurements of physical parameters. So the first in dosimetry is verification of calibration of dosimeters integrated into the medical equipment is very often not included in the quality control procedures. In some countries, it's not common, but we have seen this in quite many places. There is a requirement for mandatory calibration or verification of all instrumentation that is used for patient dosimetry to be sent to a secondary dosimetry laboratory. That is, in practice, impossible for all integrated devices. So national regulation in some countries, metrology regulation, does not allow cross-calibration in a clinical environment. So that means does not allow the use of devices integrated in the X-ray equipment. The third maybe is that data collection for establishing DRLs for typical doses is very often, quite often, I could say, performed without paying attention for the accuracy of those displays, somehow forgotten, just collecting doses, analyzing them, publishing DRLs, but without ensuring that these doses are correct. Overuse of effective dose, although it's not the main topic of the discussion today, but it's important to highlight that effective dose is not appropriate for example, setting DRLs, or it has very limited application in diagnostic radiology because of the high uncertainty. And if we use this quantity, uncertainty should be taken into account. And maybe the last in this group, the lack of standardization of phantoms and methods for calculation of organ doses and effective dose, a topic that is well known, and ICRP has established several task groups to address these problems. The second group is related to QC, to measurements of physical parameters of medical equipment. Very often in some countries, we have seen this and discussed with my colleagues from the medical physics section of the IAEA, that this is not seen as a part of a quality assurance program, clinical quality assurance program, but very often as a regulatory activity or metrology testing of the equipment. And it's very often performed by external laboratories, companies, or so-called technical support organizations to the regulatory bodies. Of course, external laboratories has their place in the whole process, but this is a responsibility of medical physicists that is sometimes forgotten in the requirements. So very often, accreditation of these groups is required as a mandatory accreditation following ISO standards or other relevant. Of course, accreditation is a very good thing, but it should not be the only requirement, and according to the BSS, it's not mandatory requirement. Involvement of medical physicists is very often, in many places, not required in the regulation. So this is a problem of the regulation, of the national regulation, because the international safety standards are quite clear on this. So complicated requirements exist, and of course, quite expensive and slow process for inclusion of all QC and dosimetry instrumentation in a national metrology register. There are few countries we face this in the recent years, even through procurement of equipment to be delivered to the member states. that there is this process of including these devices into the metrology register that complicates the process. So, and these problems are due to, in my opinion, two different reasons. Lack of resources, appropriate equipment, software, but also human resources, qualified medical physicists and qualified regulators, inspectors who understand the complicated requirements, specific requirements for X-ray imaging. And due to regulatory issues, incomplete, outdated national radiation protection and metrology legislation, sometimes wrong interpretation, and conflicting requirements of metrology and radiation protection legislation. And of course, very often lack of cooperation between different authorities and professionals. And to conclude here, I could state that current international safety standards and guidance provide sufficient basis for establishing a comprehensive program for X-ray imaging dosimetry. But further efforts are needed for the implementation, to address the implementation problems and challenges. Better coherence is needed between the metrology and radiation protection regulation and respective authorities. And of course, need to strengthen requirements for continuous monitoring and need to further develop a standardized computational phantoms and methods for mostly for calculation of risk-specific quantities. Thank you for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Jenia. I think it's really excellent presentation. And I would agree with you that we have the regulations in place, but we just need to, first of all, implement them in our countries and then have professional staff who can take care of the measurements and understand the challenges, what we have been talking about today. And luckily, we have a professional for that, and that's a medical physicist, and I hope they should be involved in these measurements. And that's why we also have a medical physics perspective in this webinar covered by Olivera, Ciraj. She's also representing the IAEA, but now giving the perspective of medical physicists. Over to you, Olivera.
Thank you, Paula. It's a great pleasure to be part of this webinar. It's very, very exciting, also from the perspective of the audience that I take partially. And in the next 10 minutes, I will try to send a couple of messages, starting from why dosimetry is important in X-ray imaging from the clinical perspective, what is the role of medical physicists, what are the current technologies that we are using in X-ray imaging, and what are the related challenges from the dosimetry perspective, what dosimetry methodology we are using, what are the uncertainty requirements, and a couple of points on the potential way forward. So we use dosimetry in X-ray images for various reasons that can be broadly classified to those that are aimed to set and check standards of good practice, for example, for the performance testing of the imaging equipment, or for optimization of procedures and practice, for example, as a part of the DRL process that is very popular nowadays. But we also use dosimetry to assess the detriment or harm or risk, and these are the cases when we need to assess organ dose, or in some rare situations, even effective dose. We heard several times about medical physics, and I'm sure that most of you are already familiar, but just to highlight that medical physics is a health profession with specific education and training that is able to practice independently in several sub-disciplines, out of which diagnostic and interventional radiology is prominent part. Jenia provided excellent overview of the requirements of the International Basic Safety Standards and the role of medical physicists with it. These requirements are excellently transposed to the roles and responsibilities of the medical physicist, according to another agency publication defining exactly the roles and responsibilities of medical physicists in different areas. And From this slide, you can already conclude that basically dosimetry in diagnostic radiology is not possible without access to medical physics service or medical physicist, or the other way around, compliance with the requirements on the international basic safety standards are not possible without medical physics service. When we speak about X-ray imaging procedures, this is something that we refer as diagnostic and interventional radiology. And in this discipline, the basic product in most of the cases is medical image. And when we speak about the quality in this discipline, we have somehow to marry image quality and radiation dose and think about figure of merit, which could be, for example, ratio of these two as key performance indicator. These procedures are very diverse and not standardized compared to the laboratory procedures. And related to this, the amount of radiation that is used to generate medical images is very much affected by procedure complexity, patient characteristics, and disease severity, which consequently generates very wide distribution of patients' doses, sometimes even for the same type of procedure and anatomical region. And just to provide sense of the order of magnitudes in terms of effective dose, because this is the way how we can compare different procedures, X-ray imaging procedures vary from several microsieverts up to hundreds of millisieverts. And if you would like to think in terms of air kerma or grays, then the range starts from several micrograys up to grays and stretch over the several orders of magnitudes, like 5 to 6 orders of magnitudes. And sometimes even in medical imaging procedures or interventional procedures, the dose to certain organs, for example, to skin, as presented on this slide, could be several grays or even higher. And this is the difficult from dosimetry perspective. There are different ways to classify X-ray imaging procedures. I decided to take the one that was used in the most recent ANSCAR report. So the medical X-ray imaging procedures are divided broadly to diagnostic and interventional procedures, and then diagnostic radiology is further divided to conventional and computed tomography. But then conventional is again divided to fluoroscopy and projection radiography that somehow combines radiography, dental radiology, and mammography. All these procedures are based on the use of very diverse radiation qualities in terms of tube voltage, target pit combination, and even tube design. And the images are generated or acquired in very different geometrical setups, which is again very relevant to the dosimetry considerations. Currently, we have several guidelines how to perform dosimetry. Zakithi presented International Code of Practice and another publication that is dealing with its application. There is another agency publication dedicated to the dosimetry in pediatric radiology, but we don't have time to go there today. But all these publications are basically based on the recommendations from the ICRU 74. And they consider different imaging modalities and define different application-specific qualities that are relevant to these imaging modalities. We use normally different dosimeters depending on the imaging modalities, and apply dosimetry on phantoms on patients depending on the need or specific applications. These publications also provide some guidelines on the dose assessment and analysis, especially when it comes to the organ and effective dose, and some guidelines on uncertainty assessment. From the perspective of dosimetry formalism, this is quite simple formula with which metrologists are very much familiar, and the air kerma, which is the basic dosimetry quantity used in X-ray imaging, is calculated as a product of calibration coefficients and indication of the instrument. And then comes the clinical clinical part that is somehow taken into consideration by a number of corrections, starting from difference in radiation qualities and other corrections that are reflecting the real clinical setup. Without going through details, you can see the list of different application-specific quantities that are all based on air kerma that are defined to somehow take into consideration specificities of all these various imaging modalities that we use in X-ray images. So the dosimeters are consequently designed to measure air kerma and other derived quantities like air kerma length, air kerma area product, but we also, as we heard already today in the first talk, use instruments to measure other parameters that are very relevant to dosimetry in diagnostic radiology. And again, without going to the details, this is just a snapshot of different imaging modalities, but it's not only modality, because if you see, there are different sub-modalities and different equipment that are used for radiography. For example, we use stationary and mobile that can be based on the CR or DR detectors. Then in fluoroscopy, we use stationary fluoroscopy units and mobile CR units. We also use interventional radiology units for fluoroscopy-guided interventional procedures, sometimes cone-beam CTs for interventional radiology, or dedicated fluoroscopy units that are, for example, used in urology. In CT, nowadays, we use energy-integrated detectors, sometimes with dual source, but also we have photon counting detectors incorporated in CT technology. And in mammography, for example, in one unit, we can have 2D mammography, we can have digital breast tomosynthesis, we can have contrast-enhanced mammography, and even biopsy units. These are all breast imaging modalities incorporated in the single unit that provide essentially different images and different clinical information using different geometry and different setups and different radiation qualities. In terms of tube voltages in radiography, in X-ray imaging, we use everything from 25 up to 140 kilovolts. But what is very important for X-ray imaging is the fact that, for example, in radiography, we use one short event with exposure time order of magnitude of milliseconds, which is very high dose rate. In fluoroscopy, for example, we have diverse acquisition protocols, even in a single examination, with diverse even pulse rates or different dose rates, and all these modalities are associated with certain type of automatic selection of exposure parameters that have different names depending on the modality that might further complicate the dosimetry in diagnostic radiology. I briefly mentioned different application-specific quantities, and in terms of dosimeters, the most standard ones are ionizing chambers and XMMs that we have mentioned several times, but in some specific situation, we use solid-state dosimeters, films, and other indirect methods for dose assessment in diagnostic radiology, at least when it comes to the experimental dosimetry. I already mentioned that in all these modalities we use phantoms and patients, but nowadays it's very popular to use online readily available dose indices in the X-ray machines that are different for different image modality, and big challenge when these online indices are used is basically verification for their accuracy. Typically, for the applications quantities, not organ or effective dose assessments, depending how well different influencing parameters are controlled in clinical condition, the typical uncertainty is ranging from 10 to 25%. So far we have been speaking about application-specific quantities. However, if there is a need, we might reach out to the organ dose and assess organ dose. That is quantity related to the radiation risk. And in this case, we have to use the conversion coefficients that convert measurable quantity, one of those application-specific quantities, to the organ dose. And there is a number of methods to do this. All these methods are mainly based on the certain type of phantom or mathematical model of the patient and Monte Carlo simulations for different clinical conditions and exposure scenarios. This list is not exhaustive. It is just taken from the ICRU publication, but this process by its nature brings additional uncertainty in dose assessment. Sometimes organ doses are used to calculate effective dose, but there are certain restrictions associated with the use of effective dose in medical imaging that are beyond the scope of this webinar. Uncertainty-wise, as we go down and in the traceability chain, the uncertainty, of course, increases. And Paula mentioned in her introduction that according to the IAEA codes of practice, the clinical conditions, the measurement of air kerma is typically associated with uncertainty of 5%. But if you want to go further and assess the organ dose, for example, the uncertainty will be way higher. And you can see in this slide just an idea what is the order of magnitude of the uncertainty in different applications of dosimetry of X-ray imaging. So as we have seen in previous slides, for different application-specific quantities, depending how well we control the condition, the uncertainties are up to 20%. However, if we go further for organ dose assessment, the uncertainty would be from 30 to 50%, but if the organ doses are used to calculate effective dose and effective dose is further used to calculate the collective dose, as it was the case with ANSCO report, the uncertainty would be even higher and go up to 75 or 100%. This is the nature of this field. However, there are certain things that we can do as metrology or medical physics community. And if we go back for a moment to the basic dosimetry formalism and look to the correction factors that are necessary to be applied in the clinical condition, you can see from this slide that using these corrections and using calibration factors really makes a difference. So we can, if we use proper condition and if we use proper radiation qualities that are relevant to the clinical condition, the uncertainty could be properly assessed and controlled, as opposed to the case when only indications from the instrument is used for dosimetry in diagnostic radiology. And this is especially relevant for the instruments that have pronounced energy dependence, as it is case, for example, for the kerma area product meters that are presented on these slides. And in the last two slides, I would like to summarize some challenges and caveats related to the dosimetry from the medical physics perspective. The first point already raised by Jenia is access to the medical physics service. And especially if you look to the regulations and the activities, I could say that there is a disbalance between requirements and use of patient dosimetry in diagnostic radiology and access to medical physics service, as one cannot go without the other. There is also often misunderstanding of the dosimetry formalism. And this is something that on which we can do together as a community, and also assessment of the magnitude of different influencing quantities, as there is a lot of calculation down the road. And for example, there is a difference between PMMAs that are used as phantom and tissue in terms of backscatter, for example. There are many complications, let's say, with HVL measurements and related uncertainties. And what we can also think is how to develop calibration procedures for instruments in the context of the clinical need. The calibration is very important, and the area in which we could work is, for example, to define what is the reference dosimetry in clinical environment. What is the reference dosimeter and what is the reference dosimetry quantity? We don't know in some imaging modalities as opposed to radiotherapy. How to use calibration coefficients and how to apply different beam radiation quality conditions. And this is very relevant for these dynamic imaging procedures when radiation qualities are basically constantly changing, because in this case, in theory, we might have the infinite number of calibration coefficients, but this is not practical from the clinical perspective. So probably interpolation could be solution in this case. Then cross-calibration is something that should be really considered, and I have a feeling that it is not enough use in the clinical conditions. And of course, as already mentioned, verification of those online dose indices provided by X-ray machines. And of course, uncertainty, as we couldn't emphasize more how important it is to have assessed uncertainty, and which is very relevant for the proper use of dosimetry results. And for example, especially when certain values are compared, for example, in the context of the DRL process. So we would need to think of the sort of decision rule related to the magnitude of the uncertainty of the assessed quantities. And potential way forward is, we should probably agree that medical physics is a key profession for dosimetry in clinical environment. And it's important to work together on promotion of dosimetry topic in medical physics community and have sort of stronger involvement of clinical staff on the topics related to the metrology of ionizing radiation and dosimetry, though the participation in this webinar would probably speak differently. And it's also important to establish more active collaboration of metrology and medical physics community and look for potentially for a balanced approach. For example, what is the balance of practicality and accuracy of dosimetry measurements, better understanding of dosimetry methods, and how we can work together to improve accuracy of at least those measurable quantities, and of course work together on better understanding and assessing uncertainty budget. We have already started this dialogue, and if you look at the IAEA SSDL newsletter 78, the dialogue started with a letter to radiation metrologists from the clinical medical physicists working in diagnostic radiology, and we look forward to the newsletter 79, in which we'll have a reply from radiation metrologists to the clinical medical physicists. With this, I would like to thank you to your attention.
Thanks a lot, Olivera. So I would fully agree with you that we need to collaborate among these different professionals. And I think it's very important that we don't stay in the calibration lab and in the hospital, but we communicate and understand each other. So I pass the floor to Helen Khoury. She's representing the radiation meteorology and calibration laboratory world. So Helen, the floor is yours.
First of all, I want to thank you, Paula, for this invitation and for the opportunity to participate in this fantastic webinar. And thank all the lecturers that talked a lot of things, important things that I need here to my presentation. Really, when we talk about the image quality and patient dose in radiodiagnostic, we know that several factors affect that. The factors like X-ray beam energy, time exposure, radiation dose. So of course, we need to make tests to have information about the operation of the X-ray and about the dose received by the patients. We need to guarantee the quality control of the X-ray equipment, and this is essential to obtain image quality. So the challenge, as we listen until now, how to do this calibration, how to obtain the correct way to measure the dose in the clinical aspects. Well, first of all, I think that one of our challenges as the calibration laboratories is the technological advances that requires studies. And these studies oblige us to stay all the time studying and implementation and calibration protocols and see what is new about the function of the new dosimeters. In special, we have a problem with the not problem, but challenge with the calibration of semiconductor detectors, because many of these detectors have different softwares, and sometimes we don't have these softwares at our calibration laboratory, or sometimes it's difficult to install and operate these softwares. Besides, we know the semiconductor present high energy dependence response. So when we calibrate at our laboratory, the quality of the beam is different from the quality that we will find at the hospital. So this makes difference for the response of the semiconductor. Here I present a graphic for you. It is a result of the study we did with the semiconductor using different radiation quality for mammography. Here in Brazil, we usually, or the majority of the calibration laboratories, use for mammography calibration dosimeters, X-ray with the target tungsten and a filter molybdenum. We don't have all the different characteristics of the target and filter that we found in the clinics. So here we studied the response. If we calibrate, for example, this semiconductor with the target tungsten and molybdenum, and use it, for example, in the clinics, molybdenum, you see the coefficient, calibration coefficient is different. So this means that when we calibrate in this type of quality beam and using the hospital, maybe we will have some errors in the dose measurement. And what happened that the user here in our country, for example, is mandatory that they send the equipment to be calibrated in the calibration laboratory. But when they receive the certificate, for example, if we calibrate with RQR5 and they have to use it in a hospital, they don't have the RQR5 because maybe they have the same kilovoltage, but not the same filters. So many times they receive the certificate, but don't use the calibration factors. Just do it to fulfill the regulatory of the country. So we need to think about, this is an important point, and many of the previous lecturers talked about this, the importance to adjust the calibration with the quality X-ray at the calibration laboratory and the quality beam on the hospital. Besides that, well, and for mammography, there are several radiation qualities available in the clinics, and the calibration laboratories don't have all of them to perform the calibration. And when have some different qualities, the user don't want to pay because the cost is high to calibrate in different qualities. So we really need to think about, this is a big challenge to think about it, how to solve this, or maybe do a document to help the user what to do with the certificate, or how to use it in the hospital measurement. Other point I want to put here is the challenge for the laboratories to install and operate the calibration laboratories. Some laboratories have difficulty to access international standards. We are talking all the time about international standards, but for example, let me talk about Latin American region. English is not our mother language. So it's difficult for the technician at the laboratory sometimes to read or understand the document, the standard document. The price of the documents are high. So this represents a difficulty for the laboratories. Another important point is the uncertainty, calculation uncertainties. As measurements become more precise and complex, the calculation of the uncertainty becomes more challenging. So this is another important point to think about it. Another point is the difficulty in obtaining accreditation due to a lack of resources, both in terms of financial and human resources. So we know that the importance to have accreditation, but many times the laboratories have difficulties to implement these accreditations. Another specific difficulty is in performing proficiency testing and interlaboratory comparisons. If a country has only one laboratory, it's difficult to do interlaboratory comparison. To send the equipment to the other country, we have a lot of problems with the customs, costs, and so on. So it is another difficulty of the calibration laboratories. And another point important is to purchase and maintain the equipment, especially X-ray. Many times when we have problems with the X-ray equipment, it's difficulty to have the maintenance in our country. So you need to pay to someone come from other countries. So this represents cost, and many times it's difficult to repair. So this is some of the challenge that the laboratories, calibration laboratories, have sometimes. So what we can see in conclusion that the challenge can be summarized as follows. Technological advances require constant improvement and adjustments to the calibration system. The impacts of measurements carried out in hospital using different radiation qualities than those used in the calibration laboratory must be evaluated. The challenge encountered by laboratories in certain countries in conducting interlaboratory comparisons, exercise, and or performance tests are important point. And some countries have encountered difficulties in training qualified personnel maintaining calibration infrastructure in their laboratories. Very quickly, this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Helen. This was really, really great perspective from the calibration point of view and also from the other side of the world. So I really appreciate your presentation. Thanks a lot. So then it's the time for the last presentation. First of all, I would like to thank all the presenters. I think it has been an amazing webinar. I'm very happy with the content. I hope that the audience agrees with me. And now we have heard about all the challenges, and now I will have this short presentation about current efforts for improvement. So the TRAMEXI project was already mentioned several times. The word TRAMEXI comes from Traceability in Medical X-ray Imaging Dosimetry. It's a Euromed project. It was submitted on a normative call, so it aims to support the regulations and standards. It started 1 year ago, and it will still go on for 2 years. We have 14 beneficiaries, so it includes 11 metrology organizations and 3 hospitals. We have also 3 collaborators in the project and an extensive committee of stakeholders covering, for example, the IEC, IAEA, HERCA, and EFOMP, and different manufacturers, calibration labs, and medical physics associations. In short, the project aims to do 3 main things. So first of all, we have heard today many times that there is a challenge that we don't really cover the clinically relevant radiation qualities. So we aim to improve this situation, improve the coverage of clinical conditions in calibrations. In addition, we want to understand the performance of different dosimeters because we need this data to be able to estimate the related uncertainties. We also want to provide harmonized guidance for calibration measurement and provide them in procedures and update the procedures accordingly. And as mentioned before, we also aim to provide support to this IAEA CRP, which was presented by the Zakithi. So we have seen these curves today. Let me just summarize them shortly. So we have the RQR qualities, which we are currently using for calibrations for general radiology devices or dosimeters. the challenge is that the clinical radiation qualities are spread around. So we have many filter, the two-voltage filter combinations. So there are a huge range of different radiation qualities used in clinical practice, and our current standard radiation qualities do not cover them. The challenge is also that if we have this calibration point and we have the measurement point here, which has exactly the same HUL, we cannot really, it would be quite difficult to do an interpolation or use this calibration factor because the spectra is so different. Even if we fix the two voltage, the spectra is even more different if we compare these two, the purple and the orange spectra here, we can see that the spectra is very different. So if we are using a dosimeter which has a strong energy dependence, we would probably have some trouble if we use this one calibration point for these two different spectra. So how we can tackle this challenge? So we could, for example, extend the range of calibration points. So we would have additional points here. Then if we select them correctly, we could, for example, do some interpolations maybe between the points if we have a detector which allows us to do an interpolation. If we have additional points, we can do also these kind of interpolations to other directions. So as a function of two voltage or as a function of filtration. So we would always use two different radiation quality specifiers for these interpolations. In mammography, the situation is even more challenging because it's not only adding up the filtration, but we have different anodes, we have different filtrations, we have K-edge filters. So the spectra is really changing, the shape is changing. So that's why it is really a challenge to do this thing on cover the clinically relevant radiation qualities in the calibration practice, because we cannot have all these points available in calibration labs. So it would be just too much, and we cannot have all different devices available in the calibration labs. So what we are planning to do in the work, it's one, we have reviewed what are the clinically relevant radiation qualities, and we aim to write recommendations to IEC, as was mentioned by Wesley, that we want to write some recommendation how to update the reference radiation qualities, which are also used for calibrations. In addition, we have done some spectrometry. So PTP and Stefan Poitinger is leading this work package, and we have done the spectrometry not only in the laboratories, but we are also doing clinical spectrometry because we want to see what is actually the spectra in clinical devices, because we don't have all the information available. There might be information in the manual that this has more than 2.5 millimeter of aluminum attenuation or filters, but we don't know what is actually inside. We want to know exactly what is the spectra in the clinical practice. In addition, we want to publish the spectrum catalog, where we will publish different spectra what we have for these reference radiation qualities in different laboratories. So anybody can go and see how these nominally similar radiation qualities are changing between different laboratories. The second challenge is the dosimeter performance. So we have another IEC standard which gives the requirements for dosimeters in specific conditions. And for example, for radiation quality, for the energy dependence of the response, the range of radiation qualities are limited to the current reference radiation quality, so the purple line on this side. And now the question is, what happens when our measurement condition is outside of this specified range? So we don't really know. This is the challenge. So it can be that the detector is performing perfectly within the reference radiation qualities, but we don't know what happens here. So either we need to put more strict requirements or extend the requirements in the standard, or at least we need to know how these detectors are performing so that we can estimate the uncertainties related to this change in condition. So this is one example. We have one detector 1, which is actually a high reference class ionization chamber. And when we have the calibration condition and we go to something else, this is actually the BIPM CCRI, low and medium energy X-rays, and we jump from RQR or RQT, the change is quite small, even though we have here some copper filtration included. So the energy dependence is not too large, and we could do some interpolations between different spectra, and uncertainty would be small. However, if we look at another example, we have this calibration curve, the purple line here, and then we have a set of different clinical radiation qualities. And we can see that the variation is much larger, and we would make a quite big error if we actually use this point as a calibration coefficient for this clinical beam. And this is also due to the challenge that these XMMs are actually using different software programs to do the calculations for different beams. So then the question is that how they can actually use the calibration coefficients, what they get in the certificate, because it might actually cause more errors if they are using these calibration coefficients for this beam. And the challenge is, of course, we cannot also provide calibration for all these different beams and clinical conditions. So it would be quite, the question is really how to use these calibration coefficients and what is the uncertainty related to this variation in clinical practice. So in the second work package, we have actually been reviewing what dosimeters are used in clinical practice, and we have set the criteria for performance evaluation. So we prepared the protocol, and now we started to do testing for different dosimeters, and we want to see how big variation or what kind of results we get with different detectors, and this would give us data for the uncertainty estimation. We also want to give recommendations to IEC to improve the standard for dosimeters, and maybe there could be more strict requirements for this reference class equipment, as we have, for example, in the similar standard what we have for radiotherapy dosimeters. The third challenge is the calibration of XMMs and use of XMMs. So as we have heard today several times, these XMMs measure not only air kerma, but also other X-ray quantities and parameters. However, we don't really have harmonized calibration methods or measurement methods for these devices. So there are all these quantities. We have several questions already in the chat about the PPV and KVP, what quantity we should actually use, how should we define the reference value, should we do spectrometry, should we use high voltage divider. All these discussions are ongoing, and also the uncertainty estimation, it's an additional challenge when we actually want to do the calibration for these quantities. There are also some questions related to use of XMMs, because the measurement geometry is very different. We heard today from Sören that they are more like there is an internal collimation which is different than what we have in the ionization chambers. When we are using them in the clinical practice, where we have a lot of scattering, very different scattering conditions, we have to make sure that our measurements are comparable. I already mentioned the use of calibration certificate and this data, and also the use of the software, the radiation quality selection and version updates and so on. So in the work package 3, we aim to review the clinical needs. What should be actually the target uncertainty for different measurements? And we also want to provide guidance how to do, or we want to harmonize the procedures, how to do calibrations of these XMMs and how to do measurements with these XMMs. Based on this data, we want to provide a report to IAEA officers so that they can use this for the update of TRS-457. So we are really collaborating together with them and with their CRP. And in addition here, we also want to give recommendations to IEC. There is a standard for tube voltage measurements. So maybe there is need for some updates for that standard. But in addition, and more explicitly, we want to discuss and communicate what to do with the other parameters and quantities measured by these XMMs. Do we need new standard, or should they be included in other existing IEC standards? So we have 3 additional work packages. We will establish these new calibration methods and radiation qualities. So we want to, of course, validate them, because we are doing methodology. So we need a comparison. We will run a comparison in terms of air kerma and tube voltage. We want to create impact. I welcome you to visit our website, ramexi.com. And then, of course, STUK is managing this project, and I'm the coordinator of this project. Just the last slide, I just wanted to mention also that I said in the very beginning that the measurable quantity is not the patient dose. So if we want to estimate the patient dose, we also need to take into account the irradiation patient properties. And this way we can actually do patient-specific optimization and do personalized medicine, which is now a very topical topic to discuss about this. One example is another EU-funded project where I'm also participating, and it's called eViolin, where we aim to do optimization of oncological CT imaging. And there we, for example, had one work package where we did calculation of organ doses. So we had the same measurable quantity as a starting point. We always need a measurement in the beginning, but then we were comparing the different tools available for organ dose calculation, and we were estimating uncertainties related to that last step. I think the best part of this project has been collaboration between different professionals. So there are physicists, radiologists, and radiographers working together and doing optimization of these patient exposures. There has been an excellent education and training webinar, 4 of them, and the link is available on APR website. So I also encourage everybody to try those webinars and see those ones. Okay, so this is my last slide. I just want to thank you for your attention and for this excellent webinar. All the speakers again. This is the Tramexi partners in the group photo.